Well, joining us now, a very special guest, Ambassador John Bolton. Sir, thanks very much for being with us. The civil nuclear deal a couple of years back, in fact several years back, was seen to be a landmark deal between the United States and India. Do you believe that this is the most substantive meeting or state visit that's taken place since then?
Well, certainly in terms of the economic consequences, as you've been enumerating, this is a number of very significant steps forward. But of course, they also deal importantly on security questions, and I think have an additional importance for that reason. There's a lot to talk about here, many complicated issues, but I think these steps indicate the direction that we need to go in the future to deal with the challenges that both countries face. And you have to name it to understand it, the challenge of China. There are many other issues to cover as well, but that is a significant threat to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's what Congress wants to hear, the Prime Minister's views on that in particular.
So, Ambassador, you would say that it is that common security concern, which is obviously China, which is actually driving a lot of what we are seeing, specifically the jet engine deal. America has not transfer this sort of technology to any other country in the world. Is it driven by the fact that America needs India to be secure?
Well, I think that's right. I think it's really a joinder of the economic and the security, and I think that's the sort of thing we'd love to see because it draws the two countries closer together. We have common political structures, if we have more economic relations, common security interests, as the United States does with many countries around the world, I think that helps create stability in the region. There's no doubt about it.
Ambassador, you've seen the relationship from a strategic standpoint grow between India and the United States. In terms of China, how has that relationship really been beneficial for both nations?
Well, I think the threat that China poses, India has seen it in recent years more directly, I think, than any other country, with attacks along the line of actual control, threats to extend Chinese influence into Pakistan even more than it already is, Chinese efforts to map the floor of the Indian Ocean. They're not doing that to study the growths of coral. That's for strategic reasons. And these interests, I think, come together with others in the region, with Japan, with Australia, as you've mentioned already, in the Asian Security Quad. Nobody's looking for conflict here. Quite the contrary. I think these efforts to grow closer in security cooperation are to create structures that will deter Beijing from taking belligerent action. That's what we really want. This is to help ensure peace and stability.
Could you talk us through the foundational agreements which have actually taken us to this step? Had those agreements not been there, then we wouldn't be looking at high-end technology transfer. And those foundational agreements, which you've looked through very, very closely in your own work, define the strategic relationship between our countries.
Yeah, look, this has been in process for some time. I mean, for many years, I don't need to tell you or your listeners, people saw the relationship with India as half of the India-Pakistan issue. I think 20 years ago, during the George W. Bush administration, we broke that nexus, that we could have clear discussions with India on issues we have in common. And I think there's been a steady growth in cooperation. And I think today the most significant evidence of that cooperation to date. But I think what this shows is that this is not mere theater, as sometimes happens in international affairs. This shows the growing connection between the two countries for reasons that have their own merits, certainly on the economic side, but are propelled by events in the world, not the events we've undertaken, but threats that we have seen from others. And I think this is a good basis on the bilateral side, absolutely. But I think it says to others, look, we can cooperate. You can join us in cooperation. We can increase all of our prosperity and increase our security, too.
But, Ambassador, we've got differences as well. Russia, India has a very close relationship. Is there an acceptance in the United States that that relationship between New Delhi and Moscow isn't going to go away? It can't.
Well, I don't think it can go away in the short term, but I think this is a hard decision that faces India because in addition to the U.S.-India Russia relationship, and we've got the biggest land war in Europe going on because of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The fact is that the Beijing-Moscow axis is growing day by day. And in this new Sino-Russian alliance, unlike in the Cold War, China is the dominant partner. It's not Russia, not the Soviet Union. It's China that's the dominant partner. And it's very hard to imagine that India would want to allow itself to continue to have a significant dependence on Russia for sophisticated military weapon systems when Russia is growing closer to what I think the main danger to India and the United States is, that is to say, China. So this is a complexity. I think the two leaders will certainly be talking about that, because if you look for greater security cooperation, one thing we've learned over the years is that interoperability of weapon systems, compatibility, communications among them are critical to effective security. And when you have the Russians supplying both China and India, when China represents the main threat, that's a real problem to deal with.
And yet, Ambassador, the heart of the Indian military setup is essentially Russian at one level. More than 300 T-90 tanks, close to 270 Sukhoi 30 fighters. Even if there was a will to move away from Russian weaponry to perhaps better quality American weaponry or made in India weaponry, it realistically can't happen because it's simply unaffordable at the scale that India needs it, which is a practical reason why I would suggest that not even in the medium term would India and Russia move away from each other from a military relationship.
Well, I think it's going to take time. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think you're right. Obviously, time and money are closely related here, but it's looking at the long-term trajectory going forward. I don't think there's any reason why India's own capacity in the military space should not be expanding. That way, you won't have to be dependent on Russia. Certainly welcome to buy American arms, but you could manufacture your own. There are companies in Europe that produce good weapon systems as well. I think it's making a strategic decision that to deal with the main threat, which is where I think India's military sees it coming from China, you don't want to be dependent on somebody that may act at the direction of Beijing in time of a crisis. This is something new. Look, this has just been developing. We've seen Xi Jinping's recent visit to Moscow, which I think cemented the axis in place. And that's a change in strategy of tectonic proportions. So India's long-term reliance on Russia for strategic weapons, you can see the history, you can understand it, but history moves in a lot of different ways, and China's moves on Russia, I think, have presented a new strategic dilemma that can be solved by growing closer to the U.S., by increased capacity in India, and looking to other suppliers as well.
Ambassador, the other point of difference, of course, is India's import of oil from Russia. It's not that India doesn't have close relations with Ukraine, we obviously do, and it's not because we are oblivious to what the West has to say about the import of Russian oil. The fact of the matter is that India we have our own requirements. It's a huge economy, it's a huge population. Energy prices are expensive and we are getting a good deal over here. So in our national interest, the argument which is raised is that, look, we just have to go ahead and do this. America doesn't accept that argument, but isn't it again a pragmatic decision being taken by New Delhi?
Well, again, perhaps in the short term, but consider the longer term implications. What's at stake in Ukraine is an act of unprovoked aggression by Russia. This is something that we've certainly been imperfect in our concern about it over the years, but it's one reason we stood with Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in another act of unprovoked aggression. It's why we stand with Ukraine. So I think India should be looking to find alternative sources of energy. Again, that doesn't happen overnight, but from the U.S., from the Middle East, much closer, much more secure than oil and gas supplies from Russia. I think that's something we should be looking at very carefully. And again, I hope the two leaders are talking about that.
A final question. President Biden just a little while back said that he intended to speak with Prime Minister Modi on an entire gamut of issues, which included the issue of human rights and democracy in a larger sense. Now, obviously, there are differences between India and the United States. It's become a prickly issue at some levels. But do you believe that both sides have the maturity to sort of deal with these differences without sort of talking down to each other?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think it's something that two friends can talk about and discuss. All I'd say is comparing the U.S. system, the India system, with the alternatives of China and Russia, we may have some issues between us, but we've got a lot more in common than we do with the other two countries.